welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 60. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of a new retelling of the events surrounding and including the Trojan War. Called Elektra, it's told via 3 narratives, all women. Hello, Jennifer Saint.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
When did you first become interested in Greek mythology?
I would just say that I've always been interested in Greek mythology for as far back as I can remember. And I think it was really my parents that encouraged it. They had family friends who lived in Cyprus who we were lucky enough to go and stay with when I was tiny. And they took me to see all these ancient ruins and told me the stories surrounding it. So Greek mythology is something that I really grew up with. It just always really captured my imagination, I think.
And have any other, Roman, Norse mythology, has that ever come into play at all?
Well, now I've got an 11-year-old son and he's really broadening our interest in mythology because I had never looked that much further afield, but he's very interested in all kinds. So he reads myths from all across the world and then he tells me about them. So it's definitely something that I think there's so much more that I don't know about that I'd be really open to learning.
Oh, fantastic. So maybe some books in mythology in general then in your future.
Yeah, I hope so.
So your book takes us from the marriage of Helen through the war and to the deaths of Clytemnestra and Aegisthus via the narratives of Elektra, Clytemnestra and Cassandra. It's women-led and women-focused, as said. Shall we start with your reading? Because you've got a reading from the prologue, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, and so the prologue is in Elektra's voice. Mycenae is silent, but I can't sleep tonight. Down the corridor, I know that my brother will have kicked away his blankets. Every morning when I go in to rouse him, he has them in a wild tangle about his legs, as though he's been running a race in his sleep. Maybe he runs after our father, the man he has never met. When I was born, it was our father who named me. He named me for the sun, fiery and incandescent. He told me that when I was a little girl, that I was the light of our family. Your aunt's beauty is famed, but you're far more radiant than her already. You'll bring more glory to the house of Atreus, my daughter. And then he'd kiss me on my forehead before he sat me down. I didn't mind the tickle of his beard. I believed what he said. Now, I don't care about the lack of suitors clamouring in our throne room for me. I've heard the stories about my Aunt Helen and have never felt envy. Look where her beauty led her, all the way to a foreign city that has held our men for 10 years. 10 years that I have lived without my father, clinging to every victory related to us by messengers who pass through Mycenae. News of each triumph gives me a surge of pride, of elation that it's my father, Agamemnon, who has fought for so long, and who rallies his men to fight on until the towering walls of Troy crumble into rubble beneath their conquering feet. I see it all the time in my mind's eye, how he will storm the gates of the city, how they will fall cowering at his feet at last. And after it all, he will come home to me, his loyal daughter, waiting here for him as year after year passes. I know that some people will say he never loved his children, that he couldn't have done, given what he did. But I remember the feel of his arms around me and the steady beat of his heart against my ear, and I know there will never be a safer place in this world for me than that. I have always wanted to grow up to be the woman he thought I would become, the woman I could have been if only he had been able to stay, to live up to the name he gave me. More than anything else, I want to make him proud. Somewhere in this palace, I have no doubt that my mother will be wandering, staring out into the distant dark. She's always noiseless, her soft feet cushioned in delicate sandals, her hair bound back with crimson ribbons, scented with crushed petals and perfumed oils, her polished skin gleaming in the moonlight. I won't leave my chamber and risk encountering her. Instead, I rise and walk towards the narrow window cut into the stone. I expect to see nothing when I rest my elbows on the sill and lean out, nothing except perhaps a smattering of stars. But as I watch, I see a beacon leap into flame up on a distant mountain top, and in answer another light, and then another in a chain of fire that leaps towards Mycenae. My heart pounds in my chest. Someone out there is sending us a signal, and there is only one thing that all of us are united in waiting to hear. A flutter of orange sparks spiral into the sky as another beacon lights closer still. Tears start in my eyes. As I watch the beacons in disbelief, I feel a spark ignite within me, the dazzling realization of what this means. Troy has fallen. My father is coming home.
Thank you. I've thought about how to approach this book because obviously there's going to be people that know everything about these stories. There's going to be people that don't know anything. I think if we fall somewhere in the middle, possibly because that's also partly where I fall. Can I ask you, why Elektra herself? Why is she the title character, etc.?
One thing I will say is that was a process for me to establish that she was the title character. And I know that when you read the novel, actually she doesn't feature very much in the early chapters. And I think people might be reading it thinking, why is this book called Elektra? Because it's a novel that really builds around her. And of my three narrators, Elektra, Clytemnestra, and Cassandra, she was the one that took the most difficulty, I think, in puzzling out. And because I think she was the most challenging, the most difficult to understand, that made her in the end the most rewarding. And everything in the story comes to hinge on her decisions. It's her hatred, her desire for revenge that actually burns the strongest in the whole novel. And so she grew to take over the story. But it didn't start out as being called Elektra. That title came actually quite late on in the writing process when I realised the story that I was actually writing as opposed to the story that I thought I was writing.
So what was happening before this? What kind of story did you maybe think you were writing, and how was that going?
So I definitely started with Clytemnestra because for me, she's the most immediately accessible of the characters. I was so drawn to her because she's a woman who is frequently maligned in Greek mythology. When she's viewed through the male perspective, she's quite a terrifying figure. For example, in the Odyssey, Clytemnestra is referred to by the shade of Agamemnon down in the Underworld, and he compares his wife to Odysseus's wife. So Odysseus legendarily had this extremely faithful wife, Penelope, who stayed at home for 20 years while he was fighting at Troy and then spending so long getting home. Penelope was fending off the suitors. She was making sure that she kept Ithaca, their island home. She kept the control of it for Odysseus's return. Whereas Clytemnestra spent Agamemnon's absence plotting her revenge against him for the terrible thing that he did to her, which is that he sacrificed their daughter in order to get a fair wind to sail to Troy. So Clytemnestra and Penelope get compared as these sort of examples of wives. And Agamemnon, I mean, fair enough, he's got a grievance against Clytemnestra. She's the reason he's in the underworld. But he holds them up as these sort of polar opposites of womanhood. Of, here is a good woman, Penelope, and here is a bad woman, Clytemnestra. And that's something that really grates on me because nobody is ever comparing the men, what kind of husbands they are. Odysseus and Agamemnon are both unfaithful. They both betray their wives. Neither of them are good examples of what it takes to be a husband. But it's always the women who end up pitted against one another. And for me, Clytemnestra has got so much righteousness about her. She's obviously planning a really brutal revenge on her husband, but it's very hard not to sympathise with her when we're looking back at it, certainly from a modern perspective, because Agamemnon has murdered their firstborn child in order to sail to war, and that it's so unforgivable. And you understand her hatred of him and how it builds and builds and builds in his absence. So for me, she was such an easy way into the story because I felt that here's somebody who's been labeled as this wicked woman, but she's got such a powerful, such a compelling story to tell. And she's driven by this deep maternal love. And that was a real way for me to see who she was from the very start, whereas Elektra was much more opaque to me from the beginning. So it really began as Clytemnestra's story, and it really evolved to become Elektra's in the end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, you said sympathise then. Is Clytemnestra the character that you sympathise with most?
I think she's the most immediately sympathetic. Well, actually, I suppose it's Cassandra who is the most sympathetic, because Cassandra really, her story is so completely tragic, that I suppose I probably felt the most sympathy for Cassandra, but perhaps the most empathy with Clytemnestra. So I think that, you really pity what Cassandra goes through. She wants to be a priestess of Apollo. She wants to devote her life to serving the god. But he comes to her in the temple and he propositions her. And when she says no, he gives her this terrible curse that although she will have the gift of prophecy and be able to see the future, no one will ever believe her. It's such a sad story because she can then foresee that her city is going to be destroyed. It's going to be completely annihilated. And whatever she does to try and save it, nobody will take her seriously. So she's got the most kind of pitiful plight. She's certainly, I think, the most sympathetic. But Clytemnestra, I suppose I felt that there was kind of a wrong to right for Clytemnestra in terms of her character, to really see this unfolding from her point of view and to know the pain and the grief that she suffered and why she then went on to take control of her own destiny the way that she did. She was never going to let another man devastate her world again. But then as I started to unravel Elektra, then I could really start to sympathise with her perspective on the world, because she's just a child when her father goes to war. And in his absence, her mother has been emotionally destroyed by what's happened. And Elektra's not able to make sense of that. So I could certainly get a lot more sympathy for the character of Elektra by going back to that beginning, back to that trauma that shaped the rest of her life. Because when you encounter her in the ancient sources, she's already a fully grown woman. So she appears in 3 famous Greek tragedies, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But she's a fully grown woman and she's already full of seething resentment and hatred. So I think the way that she appears in those ancient sources, in mythology, she's not very sympathetic. But to look at her as a fully rounded character and to start to unpick her relationships and what drives her, she became more and more sympathetic as I went through.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I mean, I found Elektra very, very difficult. Do you think events would have gone the way they did if Clytemnestra had spent more time and communicated with Elektra?
Yes, absolutely. That's what's missing, is that straightforward communication. Because I think in so many stories of family dynamics that go so horribly wrong and become so dysfunctional, that's what's really missing, is the communication, the ability to speak to each other. And with Clytemnestra and Elektra, I think it's their similarity which really drives them so far apart. I think they're both so convinced of their own righteousness. They're just incapable of understanding one another's points of view. And the turning point, I think, from which it becomes impossible for their relationship to recover is when Elektra is a teenager. And I think that is something that is extremely relatable, that teenagers and their parents, if only they could communicate as straightforwardly and honestly as we would hope, then I think a lot of conflict would be diffused. But it's the most difficult thing. I think when you are a teenager, the idea that your parents could possibly understand what you're going through is so alien. And I think that's as true of Elektra in this kind of huge mythical ancient story as it is today. So I think that they're both too stubborn and too intent upon what they think is right, the way that they see the world. And so when they come up against that in each other, they just clash and they cannot possibly move past it.
Behind what you said is effectively the relevance that this story still has today. On this note and what you've been saying and stuff like that, why is it important further, I suppose, to keep retelling these stories? You know, they're so old, they've been rewritten so many times, everybody knows them. What's important about keeping them going?
Yeah, I think the fact that they've survived for so long speaks for itself in terms of just simply, these are brilliant stories and these are such fascinating characters that there's something so rich in them that we do keep wanting to revisit them and revisit them. And a lot of us encounter Greek mythology when we're children. So like I said, I was hearing and reading the stories when I was a child, and then I in turn read them to my own children. So when we read them or hear them as children, they're so exciting and they're so larger than life. And it will be things like, you know, we'll hear the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, and we'll hear the story of the Trojan War we'll hear about how the heroes were fighting on the battlefield and the deaths and the drama and the intervention of the gods. And those are really exciting stories, and heroes win their immortal glory. And there are monsters and there are huge epic adventures taking place. And that's really exciting when you're a child. But then as you grow older and you start to revisit them, then I think you realize how many layers and how many nuances there are. And it becomes so irresistible to keep peeling them back to think, oh, actually, well, what about if we look at this story from a different person's perspective? So, like in my first novel, instead of Theseus and the Minotaur, what about hearing it from Ariadne's side? When it comes to the Trojan War, I don't want to be in the heat of the battles. I want to be with those women standing on the walls or back in Mycenae, waiting to hear news of the war, and know how they bore a very different cost and a very terrible cost of that war. And when I hear it from that side, or when I start to explore it so I can tell it from a different perspective, then I find that there are other stories underneath. And there's always so many parallels that you can draw. And I think that's probably why we have mythology and why we've always wanted to tell mythology, because it deals with, at its heart, such very human and real emotions. And we can recognize that we're talking about mothers and daughters and teenagers and their parents. We can see real relationships and real human dilemmas framed in these incredible stories, framed against these magical backdrops, which adds it great colour and vibrancy and thrills, but also I think enables us to go to these places, and often to these extremely dark and dangerous places in our psyche. But we can do it through mythology in a way that is safe and in a way that allows us to kind of work through some of those anxieties. And I was writing this novel during lockdowns in the pandemic. So when I was writing Cassandra's section and she's under siege in Troy, I do think that it was a little bit, for me, a kind of a way of writing about the pandemic without actually having to write about it, which I definitely didn't want to do, because it was those feelings of claustrophobia and intensity and this feeling of there is something dangerous out there and I don't know when it's going to hurt me or my family, but that feeling of doom and danger and what's going to happen. So I think that we can always find these connections, and I really love to think that then we can be part of this huge chain of stories that have survived for so long. I find that a really amazing thought, that we have this connection to people telling the same stories and exploring the same dilemmas and same griefs as us 3,000 years back in the past. I think that's incredible.
Well, I'm wondering if we can kind of go into specifics on what you're saying. If I say, what was important to you to kind of add in and include that's missed in the other variations?
So a huge part of that was giving Elektra a backstory, because that's what she seems to be lacking in all the ancient versions. Like I said, she comes in as a fully grown woman. So to find out who she really was the most crucial thing. So the tragedies are where I drew a lot of the source material from. So that's the Oresteia, which is Aeschylus, and then Sophocles and Euripides both wrote tragedies called Elektra. In the Euripides play, she's married to this unnamed peasant. He doesn't get a name. But what we know is that he's this very noble character. Aegisthus has forced Elektra to marry him because Aegisthus wants to make Elektra powerless. He doesn't want her married to somebody wealthy because he knows that Elektra despises him and he's married to Clytemnestra. So he knows the kind of women that are in this family, and he wants to make sure that Elektra can't do to him what Clytemnestra did to her husband. So he marries her off to this peasant who never takes advantage of the situation, who respects Elektra, and, it's a sham marriage, and he enables Elektra to have the freedom to do exactly what Aegisthus feared, which is to take her revenge. And I just thought it was interesting to have a character who obviously had affection for Elektra, who would treat her well. I thought it made her, because she is such a difficult, kind of surly, fanatical, driven, puritanical kind of character, to have somebody who was a friend to her made me think, well, there must be another side to this woman. So rather than having him come in at that late stage of the story, I turned him into a character that was a friend of Electra's from when she's very young. So that's where the character of Georgios comes from in the novel. So he's an invention. And that was really to do that, so that I could see Elektra in the context of a more positive relationship, because we only ever see her in the context of relationships which are much more wrought and riven with difficulty. So I wanted to give her that kind of straightforwardly good kind of thing in her life so that we could see her in a different way and in a more rounded way as well, so that she wasn't so one note, she wasn't so one dimensional as a character. So that was the major thing that I changed in coming to this.
Georgios was a very good character. I mean, he's the way he comes in and you think, oh, it's doing good. And then now knowing that he's completely fictional, that's something I didn't know so much. And you do a very good job in kind of just like cutting it, ending the storyline where it needs to be. You've kept the focus whilst also keeping it modern. It is great.
Oh, thank you.
So to go back to what you were saying about people enjoying the myths in childhood, can I just ask what your favourite myth is? Is it Ariadne or Elektra?
It's so funny that nobody's asked me that question before. What's my favourite myth? My favourite that I would always come back to would actually be the Odyssey, I think. That's just one of my absolute all-time favourite stories. And it's definitely one where the more that I read it and reread it, the more things that I find to take issue with. And it was really funny because I loved it. I did classics A level and we read the Odyssey and I was really swept away in it and just adored it. But when I was an English teacher, I ran an extracurricular classics club. And so the kids in that club were 12, 13 and 14. And they had such a strong reaction. It's so different to mine. I think, coming like a generation later, they were so angry with Odysseus and they were really calling him out on his behaviour. They were going like, hang on, he's got a wife at home and he's having affairs with other women and he's not making very much effort to get back and all his men have died due to his incompetence. And it was so funny and interesting to see it, because I think I maybe just not looked at it through such a critical eye because I was so fond of it, because I just so enjoyed it as a story. So I think I've got a lot to thank that classics club for, actually, for having such an angry, outraged reaction. Really, it sparked so much conversation and debate and so much feeling. And it was such a good way of going back, like I said, to something I thought I knew so well and going, yeah, they really have a point. Odysseus is pretty awful.
No, yeah. I mean, yeah, you say it's wonderful when there's something that you think you've kind of got set in your stone in your head and it's something you enjoy, but that's it. And yeah, something comes along and you have to rethink it again. It's really cool. So with your narratives, you've got Cassandra, you've got Clytemnestra, you've got Elektra. Did you ever consider a different person's narrative to have this, like Helen's even? What would a difference look like?
Oh, yes, definitely. So I think especially writing mythology, whenever I'm writing a novel, there are, maybe 3 or 4 other novels that I could write just kind of under the surface of it and thinking, oh, I could have taken a different direction and tell a completely different story, because they link together so much. You can just kind of go off down these little like labyrinthine tunnels and find something else incredible to explore. And I think Helen's narrative would probably be like the most obvious alternative that I could have taken. And I did consider it because Helen is she's such an intriguing character in mythology. She's the most beautiful woman in the world and everybody desires her so much. And then they are so quick to blame her for this 10-year war of complete devastation, that so many people die and there's so much suffering, and everybody says, well, that's all Helen's fault. This is all about one woman who ran off with another man. And of course, that's completely ridiculous. Nobody goes to war just to get this one woman back. They've gone to war with Troy because they want to defeat it, because they want its wealth, because they want to take its power, because they want to take its women. It's not about Helen. But she's always blamed for it. It's such a misogynistic narrative, isn't it? That this is all Helen's fault for being too beautiful and being too promiscuous, and let's blame her for everything that followed and everything that the men did afterwards. So there's such a compelling reason to give Helen the narrative and give her the story. But because I felt such a connection to Clytemnestra, and I could just feel Clytemnestra's story. I didn't want to split it between the two of them because they're twin sisters, but there's this massive disparity in their births because although they're born at the same time from the same mother, the story goes that Helen is actually hatched from an egg and she's the daughter of Zeus, whereas Clytemnestra is a completely mortal child. So there's that imbalance between the sisters already. And I think to tell Helen's story, I just felt if I went into her narrative, that it would detract from Clytemnestra's. And that's what I wanted to put front and center, really, her sister's story rather than Helen's herself. I think it just would have taken the novel too far away. And I really wanted the perspective of what was happening in Troy at the time. But I thought it was more, perhaps a little bit more unusual and definitely a bit more intriguing to have that side of it come from Cassandra, who can see what's going to happen. I loved the idea of a narrator who everybody thinks is mad, but she's got so much clarity and so much insight. So I think in order to really give Clytemnestra and Cassandra the spotlight that I thought they deserved, I felt like I couldn't really give it to Helen in this one. But I thought it would have been so interesting to have a different novel, which could have been Helen's story, Iphigenia's story, Andromache's story in Troy as well. All these other kind of really interesting women who would have made it look probably very different.
Well, I know about when we get to the part at the beach where all the women at the beach, it struck me, and I wrote down what I was thinking. I thought, what is Jennifer saying about Helen by not mentioning her all that much and not having her as a narrator? You've got Helen there and she's kind of the reason for the story, but then at the same time, I think what you do does allow you to show that there's other importance there.
Yeah, and definitely when it comes to the scene on the beach, which was one of the most difficult parts of the story to write, Helen is going to go back and still be Menelaus's wife. So she's going to go back with all the kind of privileges, really, that she had before. Whereas those other women, they're slaves now. They're completely dehumanized. They're just the property of their conquerors. And they're all going to be split up and they're never going to know their homes again and they're never going to know their families again. So to have them as more prominent definitely seemed more important to me at that point.
Yeah, I mean, you said it, there were many reasons for the war that weren't to do with Helen, but if we take it just as it's presented on the surface, she's the reason for the war, and yet she does escape pretty much unscathed. It's quite damning in a way. In your opinion, and I know opinions have changed over time on this, but did Helen go willingly to Paris?
Well, so the very first version that I read when I was younger, I was probably like about 8 years old, I read The Tale of Troy, which is by Roger Lansell Green. I think it was written in the 1950s. And in that version, Helen is bewitched by Aphrodite. So she doesn't know what she's doing. And it's definitely not her fault. And because that's the first version I read, I suppose it's probably always lingered with me, this idea that Helen didn't do it deliberately. But it is a bit more interesting if you think that she did. And I think there's lots of reasons to think that she might have gone with Paris because she's got these great stories about her earlier life that, she's hatched from an egg. She's a daughter of Zeus. She's so incredibly beautiful that, 100 men from all across Greece come and want to marry her. And they're so desperate for her that it seems that they're going to battle each other to the death for her until Odysseus says, we'll all swear an oath that whoever marries her will all respect that and will all protect his right to have her, which is how come they all have to go to Troy when she's taken by someone else. So all these kind of dramatic, possibly glamorous things happen to her, if you wanted to look at it from that perspective. And then she's just living in Sparta, married to Menelaus, just doing what women do, which is just having children. So I can kind of see that for somebody who might think that surely she's got more of a destiny than this. Her father is Zeus, he's the king of all the gods. I can kind of see that she might have thought that maybe she did want to go and have an adventure, that maybe she did want to run off with Paris, who by all accounts was very good looking and very charming. So I can see there definitely being an argument for her going willingly. And I think it maybe makes her a bit more interesting if she's got that agency and she chose to do it.
Also, you talked about the end of what happens and things like that after the war's finished. It also kind of makes the ending and what happens to Helen more compelling.
Well, there's a great scene in the Odyssey, always came back to the Odyssey, where she's brewing up all of these herbs and she's going to drug the wine with it that the men are drinking because they're all crying over the Trojan War and all the losses they suffered. And so she bewitches them to take their sorrows away. And I really love that image of her as well, that she's so clever and she's so manipulative. And perhaps that's how she has to sort of keep the peace and stop Menelaus from turning on her for what she did. She's all about self-preservation, I think, and she manages it so well.
I hadn't thought of it like that, actually, the self-preservation. Yeah, I'm going to think about that a bit more. On Cassandra again, how has history regarded her? For example, I mean, this is going to sound awful, but if we say in context, should she, for example, have slept with Apollo? How has history regarded her down the ages?
Yeah, I think that's probably been asked before as well. Definitely, because it's such an unusual moment in mythology because so many women are put in that position by the gods and not given any kind of choice. And that is the depressing thing about Greek mythology. There is a huge catalogue of sexual assaults on women, which is horrific. But for some reason, Cassandra is able to say no to Apollo. I think that's always been a bit of a mysterious moment in the mythology and something that's perhaps not really explained, kind of what was different about Cassandra and why was she able to do that. And I think sometimes she's come out of it quite negatively. And certainly I've read accounts in ancient sources where she's described as tricking Apollo, like it's deceptive. Like she says that she will sleep with him if he gives her the gift of prophecy. And then she changes her mind and says no when he's given her the gift. And that's why he curses her. So it's almost like a kind of, this horrible rewriting of what he does to justify his anger and his punishment of her. So, kind of basically, well, she deserved it. And I've definitely seen that portrayal of her. And then with what she then becomes, which is, a woman who tries to make herself heard and isn't listened to, then she's quite often just painted as a madwoman, as this hysteric. And that in itself is such a sexist way to regard women. And she's such a metaphor for so many women then in the ancient world that her voice is just not considered important, that what she has to say is just regarded as overly emotional, as rambling, as just not important compared to what the men are saying and what the men are doing. And so she's just brushed aside. And I think that is something which feels very topical and very relevant as well, when women's voices are just not always heard and not always respected. And that's definitely the way that I've seen Cassandra presented before, just as somebody hysterical, just shrieking in the background while all the important things go on around her. And somehow nobody ever realizes, nobody ever looks around afterwards and says, oh yeah, Cassandra said that was going to happen, and then it did, but they never give her the credit.
Mm-hmm. Would you say, in the context of the stories and the myths, obviously, is it right that Elektra's left? She's there at the end.
Yeah, so she doesn't get punished for the murders taking place. So Orestes is pursued to madness by the Furies, and they come to punish people who kill their parents. So it's this particular sort of horrific crime that the Furies will come and avenge. And Elektra wriggles out from that, presumably because although she's influenced Orestes to do it, or she's encouraged and she's helped him, she hasn't actually shed the blood herself. So she gets away with that. And then all that is written of her after that is that she marries Orestes' friend Pylades, and that's all we know about her. She's sort of the last in the line of this hugely important family in Greek mythology, where they've got this catalogue of terrible crimes going back through the ancestors of the family who've done all these awful things and been punished in various ways. But it all seems to burn out with Elektra at the end. And she just kind of disappears into obscurity. There's sort of nothing about the children that she might have with Pylades, that she just disappears, and the whole family fades away from notoriety after that.
Completely out of left field in terms of the questions that I've asked so far, but not the book. And I'm going to try and say this person's name correctly. I'm probably going to say it completely wrong. What was the belief about the Underworld in terms of Iphigenia's place in it?
There are a couple of versions of what happened to her after the sacrifice. One of them has her not dying at all. So there's a version where Artemis demands that Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter, and she won't let the ship sail until it happens. But at the very last minute, because Artemis is the goddess who actually she looks after young women, so she doesn't want to kill this young woman. She doesn't want her to die. So she snatches her away at the last minute and replaces her with a deer. And then Iphigenia is taken off to be a priestess of Artemis in Taurus, I think it is, which is this very strange place. And there's a whole play about her then later on being discovered by Orestes there and reunited. So there's definitely quite a strong tradition in which she doesn't go to the underworld.
Okay, yeah, I think when I was reading, obviously it's Clytemnestra thinking, I realised that, she's kind of fixated on this. But it was kind of sad that, she's thinking of her wandering around. And I feel I should apologise to anyone listening for completely butchering that name. So, I know this book has just been published, but what's next in terms of what you're writing?
So this novel was extremely dark. And like I said, I did write it during COVID and during lockdowns. And I think that definitely had an influence. So I really wanted to write something that was a completely different tone, a total shift and a change of pace. And so my next novel, which I am editing at the moment, so will hopefully be out in spring of 2023, is telling the story of a really different heroine of Greek mythology. And that is Atalanta, who is famous as the only woman to have joined Jason and the Argonauts. She's not that well known, and she's written out, well, I'll say written out, she's not included in a lot of versions of the Argonaut story. So writing her back in was very satisfying. But I think if you haven't heard of her, there's a reason for that. And that's that it's been told as definitely very much Jason's story. And she plays a really important role.
Certainly. It sounds good. Jennifer, this has been lovely having you here today. You have taught me so much. You have also shown me how much I need to learn. And it has been lovely reading your book. The thing that I think I've possibly enjoyed the most in terms of the literature aspect of it itself, the writing, is seeing where you have strayed from the various texts, but also where you've really stayed with them and seen the balance there and what you've done with it. It's been lovely. Thank you for being here today and for discussing it all with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And they were great questions. Yeah, and I hope that my answers were interesting enough. If it does make you want to go back and read more mythology, then I think that's my job done. I'm so pleased whenever anyone tells me that. So that's great.
Links to purchase Elektra are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed today's discussion, do subscribe or follow the podcast on your listening app of choice. The Wormhole Podcast episode 60 was recorded on the 2nd of April and published on the 9th of May 2022. Music and production by Charlie Place.